Hello, welcome to our Balliol College online lecture series. My name is Jason Casellas. I'm the John Wynant Visiting Professor in American Government this year. I'll be leaving Balliol soon to go back to the United States. It's been a great pleasure being here at Balliol this year. And I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, who's no stranger to Balliol, Professor Andrew Hurrell, who's a leading British scholar of international relations. He'll be speaking to us tonight. He's currently a senior research fellow at Balliol, an emeritus professor here. He was the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford. His research interests cover theories of international relations, theories of global governance, the history of thought on international relations, comparative regionalism, and the international relations of the Americas, with particular reference to Brazil. His current work focuses on emerging powers and on the history of the globalization of international society. He was elected to the British Academy in 2011 and to the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars in 2010. He's a delegate of the Oxford University Press and a member of the Finance Committee of the Press. And his book on global order was the winner of International Studies Association Prize for the best book in the field of international relations in 2009. He will be speaking to us tonight, and his topic is A New Age of Global Disorder. While he gives the lecture, if you would please ask questions in the Q&A, you can do so during the lecture, and at the conclusion of the lecture, I'll make sure that your questions are posed and answered by Professor Hurrell. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Hurrell for his presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Jason, for that kind introduction. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be speaking to you all today. This lecture is aimed, or was aimed principally or primarily at Balliol alumni. And of course, the themes about which I'm talking today, the problems of global order and international disorder, are themes in which many people from Balliol College have played a major part. Many of those who've passed through the college have, of course, gone on to run the world in many different ways, or to contest and debate how the world ought to be run. Intellectually or academically, if you like, there is a long tradition of studying questions of global disorder in the college. The chair that I held for 14 years, the Montague Burton Chair in International Relations, was created in 1930, and its first holder, Sir Alfred Zimmern, was one of the great writers on the League of Nations, and many of his successors who've held the chair, Alistair Buchan, Hedley Bull, Adam Roberts, my immediate predecessors, and my successor, Nita Crawford, all have shared, I think, this interest in trying to make sense of patterns of order and disorder in international politics as a whole. Difficult, perhaps impossible, though it may be, to actually grasp the complexity of what is happening. But it is a particularly important time to try to make sense of the patterns of order and disorder that we're seeing in the world. We do live, as Bertolt Brecht put it, in dark times. We see the eruption of major wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East. We see many instances of mass violence in other parts of the world that are often hardly reported or noticed at all. We see an intensification of geopolitical zero-sum politics between many states, both globally and within important regions of the world. We see a fracturing of institutions, international institutions and international organizations, many of which we assumed not so long ago were well established and marching to a better and brighter future. There's a great deal of commentary on the tendencies within global capitalism, both to produce inequality and instability. And there's renewed attention to the extent to which what is happening in global capitalism, and particularly what is happening around the emergence of very large, powerful firms and economic players, is escaping the capacity of states to control what those firms do. We think most obviously in the technology sector, but not only there. And as if that wasn't all enough, there is a encroaching sense of a planetary crisis that is changing the way in which we think about our human futures, about ideas of space and time. So there's good reason for thinking about the problems of global disorder and the question of whether and how far we're living in a new age of global disorder. Very, very schematically, very simplifying hugely, we can perhaps think of the complexity about the present and likely future of global order by thinking in terms of the interaction between the old and the new. So on one side, we have the move from global challenges to planetary imperatives, as I just mentioned. We have the impact of new technologies, of new forms of scientific knowledge on economics, on war and weapon systems, on patterns of connectivity. But on the other, we see all too powerfully, all too clearly, the old logics and dynamics, especially the dynamics of international political competition, of geopolitical rivalry, of regime insecurity, of nationalist self-assertion, and of war and armed conflict. How then to make sense of this combination of the old and the new? Where have we come from? Well, a great deal, perhaps the largest part of Western debate on the emerging disorder, but not just Western debate, has been to focus on the post-Cold War period and on the so-called global liberal order led by the West and by the United States in that period. To think of this story that is often told of how the origins or the central features of what we call world order were created by the United States in the period after the end of the Second World War in the 1940s, and were then expanded and globalized at the end of the Cold War as the West won the Cold War and as the United States was able to lead this period of global governance and a new order in the post-Cold War period. So that's a very schematic way of putting it, but many people see things in that way and see the challenges that have faced that order in terms of the enemies of that kind of picture, of the rogue states, the terrorists, the illiberal authoritarians attacking a so-called global liberal order from outside. The problem, of course, with that view is that the challenges have come as much from within as from without. The critiques, the critiques of global governance and international institutions and of ways of thinking about global order that dominated the post-Cold War period have animated many, many parts of the political debate in Western countries, but not just in Western countries. The critiques of global governance, of globalism, the critiques of Davos man and woman, the critiques of this way of thinking about international order has fueled polarization inside many countries and led to a very strong antagonism to the patterns of thinking about global order that dominated the post-Cold War period. And in addition, it's hard to escape the conclusion that even if one buys that picture of a US-led global liberal order, one has to recognize that that order was brought down from within by those who conceived and led it. The problems of selectivity, of hubris, of corruption, of overextension were all too apparent in the period from the end of the Cold War through to, say, 2015, 14, 15. We often have talked about the 1930s as a low, dishonest decade. And I personally cannot help but think that when we look back on the post-Cold War period, we will see the 1990s and early 2000s in a similar way as a period where there was great possibility, but that possibility was spurned and wasted. But my main point here is not to talk endlessly about the so-called Western-led global liberal order. I'm happy to talk in questions more about that. But my central point is I think that we need to escape from the shadow of thinking about order and disorder in terms of a move from that world to another. Why? Well, essentially for three reasons. The first is that I think by framing the question in that way, we focus too much on US power and on the debates about a US-led order. There never was a global liberal order in the period after 1945. And the United States was not a global hegemon, except perhaps in very particular periods, at the end of the Second World War, and again after the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990. Instead, through the Cold War period, the very notion of the Cold War was that it was a period of East-West relations. It was also a period of challenge coming from what we then called the Third World and have come now to talk more of in terms of the Global South. This is extremely important. There are many, many ways in which we might want to think about where we are now in terms of a new Cold War. There are many dimensions to the old Cold War that we might want to investigate and think about where we are today. The nuclear side, the ideological side, the global side, the geopolitical side. But there's one very important aspect of the Cold War, which perhaps even tends towards at least a certain kind of optimism. The idea that nothing happened in terms of order building, institution creation, developments in international law through the Cold War is fundamentally misconceived. It was a period of great tension, great danger, but it was also a period where institutional and legal developments took place. Think of the law of the sea, think of developments about the international and global environment, think about developments even in such areas as human rights. We know far too little about why it is that in periods of geopolitical tension, certain sorts of institution building and legal development can continue both to exist and be stable, or even to be developed. And understanding more about that is really crucial to understanding where we might be going in the period that we now face. So there's too much focus on US power. We need to escape from, that's one aspect of escaping from the shadow of the post-Cold War period. We also need, I think, to escape from this overemphasis on hegemony as the only way of thinking about global order. So we see all around us this discussion of moving from an American-led order to a Chinese-led order. And the whole focus is, what does the United States want? What does China want? As though that would explain the nature of the order that we're going to see. Now, of course, it's obviously important to know what the goals, values, preferences of major countries are. But we don't understand order simply by looking at one side rather than another. We understand order in terms of a continuous web of interaction between the major players over time and refracted through complex sets of institutions and challenges that those countries face. Order then is about strategic interaction. It's not about just what one country wants or just what one country does, however powerful that country might be. So of course, there's no shortage of bad people. There's no shortage of domestic instabilities that feed into the international. But order and disorder has to be understood, whether we're looking at the Western Russia, whether we're looking at the situation of Asia of China in Asia, at strategic interaction over time. And this really matters because I think it's important to think of the range of possibilities. So even thinking about the United States, there was a recent piece on a prospective Trump foreign policy. And the choice that this piece presented us with was either a very hard, aggressive, America first, short-term interest, damn the rest of the world view of where Trump might be going, or the United States upholding its special responsibility for a global liberal order and the provision of public goods, as those were the only two possibilities. Now, it's entirely possible that we will see the first of those, but I think it's really important to recognize that the United States becoming, quote unquote, a normal great power does not entail all of the things that those people writing about the global liberal order have come naturally to assume. And looking to the future, it seems that rather than a US-led order or a Chinese-led order, we're far more likely to see a long and dangerous period of unstable coexistence between multiple powers. And therefore, we need to think about what that means for the types of order that we might see. So we need to escape the shadow of the post-Cold War period, firstly, because of the excess emphasis on US power. Secondly, because of the excessive emphasis on hegemony and the idea that hegemony is the only thing that keeps anarchy at bay in international relations. And thirdly, because the dominant trend of the 20th century was a move away from Western power towards a much more strongly global international society. Now, in recent months, there has been a great deal of attention devoted to the positions and the ideas and the rhetoric and the language of the global South in response to the conflicts in Ukraine and in response to the conflict in Gaza and the Middle East. But there's nothing new about this. There is a deep-rooted move towards a greater desire and a greater successful role on the part of the global South. In 1926, Nehru complained about the Eurocentrism of the League of Nations and its conceptions of war and peace and security, which in his view downplayed or ignored the interests of the greater part of humanity. And in 2022, the Indian foreign minister made almost exactly the same point. Why does Europe assume that its problems are the world's problems, but that the world's problems are never its problems? So the we that is involved in ideas about global order and disorder has changed fundamentally. It's changed in two ways, which I think are often not sufficiently separated analytically. When we talk about power diffusion away from the West, there are two sorts of things that I think we really need to talk about. One is the idea of power moving from one state or group of states to another state or a group of states. This is obviously what is involved in the discussion about the rise of China, or the move of the diffusion of power from the United States to China, or the rise of India, or the rise of the global South, the increasingly important role of the BRICS in global politics, state-state power shifting in a pretty traditional form. But the other aspect of the diffusion has been not the diffusion of power from one state to another, but a much broader diffusion of what I call effective political agency, the capacity of groups, societies, and states to mobilize in pursuit of their own interests, often against external actors and against external pressures. So when we think of the way in which the Western world, the European world, say at the turn of the 20th century in 1900, found itself the apogee of its power in this truly extraordinary position of global dominance, we see much of the story of the 20th century as a story of resistance and challenge, certainly involving the end of empire, of European empires, but the end of all of the dominant 19th century empires, but also the challenge to Western, to great power, top-down ways of thinking about running the world. This was, after all, what was involved in discussions about Vietnam, the Vietnam War and the Afghanistan War. What I think, again, the focus on the post-Cold War period did was to make us forget a lot of that longer-term history and to focus instead on this historically anomalous period where Western power was reasserted so powerfully, but also so briefly. So the crucial point then, when we think about the we involved in global order and disorder is that we're not just talking about a story of China and US-China. Even when we talk about Asia, we're not just talking about China. We need to remember the importance within Asian debates on order of other states, Japan perhaps most obviously. When we talk about a story, if we tell a story of a Western liberal order and its challenge from other parts of the world, we have to remember that that Western liberal order was never simply a Western liberal order. Many, many aspects of what we've come to think of as a Western liberal order emerged in the process of challenge and resistance against Western power that took place in many countries and in many continents. Ideas of human rights, ideas of global justice, ideas of economic development, ideas of racial equality. These were all things that were not handed out from the Western core, but were fought for and contested on the part of the broader world. Academic literature has come to lay great emphasis in recent years on what's come to be called the southern sources of global norms, exactly in this way. And again, following on from that, when we think of where we are today, it is entirely inappropriate, misleading, dangerous to think that somehow the position of countries can be reduced to some two camps, Western liberal democracies facing off against illiberal authoritarian regimes. The position of the global South, now often described in terms of active non-alignment, is one which is far more complex and far more complicated than that. And finally, in this picture of diffusion, if we compare where we were during the Cold War, the relationship between the global conflict, the global logics of the Cold War, and what was happening in regions, I think we can see in many regions today, not least in the Middle East and in East Asia, there's a much greater density of regional interactions, a much greater autonomy of what happens, a much greater role for regional players in wanting to determine and to shape their own future. So where does this then leave us in terms of where we might want to go or how we might want to think about global order, this much bigger and broader we? Well, I think the first point to make really is the absence or the relative absence of debate about what future order might look like. Right across the political spectrum, people seem very clear about what they don't like. Certainly all of those who want to challenge so-called liberal views of global governance and liberal orders from the right and from the left are very clear about what was wrong, what they don't like, the unaccountability of international institutions, their capture by private interests, the selectivity, the hypocrisy of claims to universal justice, all of those things, but are much less clear about what they might seek to put in its place. Making your country great again, wanting a world of cooperative sovereign states built around non-intervention, maybe a respect for difference, for much greater diversity and pluralism. That all sounds fine, but it doesn't really take us very far. If we compare where we are now with, again, say, the 1940s or the 1970s, in both of those periods, there was a much more active discussion of what a future order might look like. And I think the first challenge that we all face is to try to look beyond the critiques, whether those critiques come against international institutions or whether they come from the global South complaining about the Western centrism and the Eurocentrism of so much thinking on global order. Those critiques are very important, but again, they only take us so far. So where might we go? Well, let me make, as I begin to move towards my conclusion, let me make 4 points and 4 sorts of pathways or ways of thinking about the direction of debates about global order as we move forward. The first one I've always thought of as a negative one, but looking around the world, I'm not so sure it is only a kind of negative one. And this is the possibility of the restoration, the reassertion of US and Western power. After all, in the 1970s, there was quite a lot of overlap and similarity with some of the things we see today. It was widely seen as a period of disorder. It was seen as a period of declining Western hegemony, with power moving to new power centers in Asia and towards the third world. It was a period of new global challenges, population, environment, nuclear weapons. It was a period of crisis in the capitalist core, economic crisis in the core of the capitalist world. It was a period of democratic crisis in the core of the democratic world in Europe and in the United States. What happened, well, again, crudely speaking and very schematically speaking, Western countries reasserted their power, again, in the face of those challenges in two sorts of ways. The first, very well known, is the unleashing of a period of market liberal financial capitalism, the new age of globalization. And the second, through the Reagan years, of a period of military expansion, particularly of taking the Cold War to the Soviet Union in many places across the third world and the global south. If we want to be a little bit Hegelian and to think in terms of the cunning of history, those sorts of moves were successful, enormously successful perhaps, in winning, quote unquote, the Cold War. But each of them sowed the seeds of some of the problems that then undercut Western power in the subsequent period. So it was precisely that phase of globalization that propelled and allowed for the expansion, not just of China, but for the diffusion of economic power across other parts of the world. And it was precisely the intervention of the West, but also of the Soviet Union in many parts of the third world, and particularly in the Islamic world, that created the conditions for backlash and opposition that have been so powerful in the period since then. Now, I just assumed that given what I'd said about the diffusion of power, that idea of reasserting Western power and being able to reassert a Western-led global order was one that was not on the agenda. And I still certainly believe that it's both unviable and would be enormously costly and dangerous if anyone sought to do it. But looking around, there are clearly people who believe that this is possible. One reads articles that actually say, no, we can defeat Russia. We can and should defeat China in the sense of forcing it to give up its pretensions for global power. Those, as I say, I think are extraordinarily dangerous ideas. And again, when we think about the problems of order, the lasting impact or the difficulties of moving away from what one former friend of mine used to talk about, hegemonic presumption, the presumption that one has a natural right to dictate the terms of order, is extraordinarily difficult and can be very, very powerfully embedded and hard to move away from. But that's one pathway, if you like. The second way that we might need to think about global order going forward is to think about the foundations. What are the essential foundations of a more orderly world? Or to put another way round, are there some aspects of global governance that really matter more than others? Or to put it, again, a slightly different way, are there ways in which we can de-risk geopolitics such that there is less danger of major conflict breaking out between major states on the one hand, and that some form of accommodation between those states might provide the space and even the willingness to build on that foundation the sorts of institutions and cooperative mechanisms that are necessary to face and to deal with the challenges of a globalized and planetary world. What do those foundations look like? Well, to me, they look inevitably rather traditional. And despite all of the difficulties and dangers that we are currently seeing, we can witness the emergence of at least an awareness of the importance of some of them. Whether they're going to be there, whether they're going to work, is entirely another question. But that, for instance, the US and China need to find and to relearn the sorts of lessons that the Soviet Union and the United States learned during the first decade and a half of the Cold War. The way in which crises that will inevitably break out can be managed, the way in which some sort of accommodation between adversaries can develop, focused most obviously around the most dangerous aspects of weapons and particularly of nuclear technologies, that through crises, through conflicts, we're beginning to become aware again of the importance of moving towards probably informal, maybe gradually more formalized understandings of, for example, the conditions of stable nuclear deterrence in a very different world, and in a world characterized or marked by very different sets of military technologies. I think we're seeing in the debates about the nuclear debates about Ukraine exactly that process. What might be the conditions for stable deterrence on the Western side, within the Western world? What might also, and far more importantly, be the conditions that might actively deter the two sides from escalating nuclear conflict around a major war such as Ukraine? Very important to, I think, remember that when we look back at the Cold War, we obviously think once again about deterrence, we think about defense. But the other great lesson of the Cold War, that if deterrence worked, it worked because it both deterred, but it also reassured. There have to be a move towards pulling in adversaries to think about what a stable security order in Europe, in the Middle East, in East Asia might look like in the coming decades. So that very old-fashioned picture of great powers managing power, that Kissingerian picture, if you like, has not gone away. Whether there are great powers able to play that role, whether the United States as a normal great power can play that role, whether China and India see themselves as playing that role, is entirely another question. But there are pressures pushing in that direction, and it's very difficult to think about global order without seeing something necessarily in that space. International law. On the one side, people think, well, maybe international law in its more modern guise, not just in the post-Cold War period, tried to do too much. It tried to expand into too many areas. It tried to be normatively far too ambitious, for example, in the way in which law and conduct in war is regulated. What we might want to see in the future is a pullback towards a world with harder sovereignty, more limited notions of international law, more limited notions of intervention and non-intervention. I'm not sure that is really the right way of thinking about the debates about the future of international law. It seems to me that the debate really has to do not with specific legal questions, even a question as apparently obvious as the need for the international community to resist overt aggression, the invasion of another country, the seizure of territory. But it has rather to do with the more foundational, the more fundamental understandings about international law. What is international law? Who makes international law? How is international law applied and interpreted? And when we think of the reactions of the global South to what is going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East, it is those questions, I think, that are most fundamental. And it is re-establishing shared understandings about those questions, which is most important. So the primacy of order over governance, the de-risking of geopolitics surely has to be there. The second point. The third point is, what about the relationship between global order, if you like, the geopolitical disorder between major powers, and the whole world of global governance, of complex global governance, that was such an important focus for discussion in the post-Cold War world. After all, there are, I think, a significant number of people who say, well, yes, global disorder, geopolitics, US-China, US-Russia, these things are looking pretty bad, but global governance doesn't look under such threat. After all, if we think of the massive expansion of the ways in which administration, regulation, the enormous density and depth of institutionalization in the post-Cold War period, much of that still just carries on as normal. You know, functionally, when you travel, you swipe your card, your bank account is debited, all of those things are embedded in systems of global governance and are still there. Even ideas of more progressive change, or trying to take forward claims of where order and governance might go in the future. So we might say, well, the Paris Agreement on climate change wasn't perhaps as successful, certainly wasn't as successful as many hoped, but the dense interconnections between international law and municipal and domestic law mean that we've seen an enormous expansion in climate change litigation, in groups that are able to go to national courts and to argue about the responsibility of their states and of their firms for actions that are contributing or causing climate change. So order and governance, maybe we need to see in rather separate boxes. And maybe we need to try and keep them in separate boxes. After all, one of the ways in which in the 20th century people dealt with these questions was to say, well, let the specialists, the scientists, the technocrats deal with the technical questions, and let the politicians and the diplomats deal with the order and disorder questions, the functionalist and neo-functionalist answers to the problem of cooperation. But it's very difficult to think of that kind of separation as happening in the 21st century, not least because of all of the changes that we think of in terms of globalization. Instead, I think we need to think about some of the, what I call institutional pinch points, where the world of global governance and global order intersect. It's obviously true in terms of global economic governance and the global economy that all that has happened in terms of competitive and conflictual geopolitics has been spilling over into the workings of the global economy. The expansion of sanctions, the expansion of friendshoring, moves towards decoupling, rethinking, refashioning global production chains, and so on and so forth. How might one think about the regulation of those pinch points? Where do we look? Well, a few examples of where we look. One I've just mentioned is sanctions. The writing on sanctions has tended to think about, do sanctions work? But the enormous expansion in sanctions activity and sanctioning activity, not just towards targeted states, but towards third-party states that we used to think of in classic terms as neutral, is a really massive change in the way in which the global economy has been politicized, with enormous potential long-term implications. Seizing assets, talking about this in Europe and the United States in relation to Ukraine. Again, the question is not, will it work? Maybe the question isn't even, is it just? But the question is, what impact will that have on trust in the financial system? What impact will it have on the capacity of Western financial centers to maintain their role in the coming decades? Trade and security. During the Cold War, because there was so little interdependence between economic interdependence between East and West, this wasn't really an issue, certainly not for the GATT. Insofar as it was an issue, there were other institutions, COCOM, and the people dealing with East-West sanctions. But with the increasing density, range, institutional reach of the World Trade Organization, it's very difficult not to think that we need to rethink the relationship between security issues and trade. This may well involve taking certain sorts of relationships out of an institutionalized trading regime in order to not to put too much weight and too many burdens on it. So those sorts of issues. I think perhaps also another old-fashioned idea is intervention itself. During the post-Cold War period and in the world of global governance, apart from humanitarian intervention, debates on intervention sort of faded away. We'll deal with those within the realm of technical agreements on nuclear security or on cyber governance or on global health. They'll be managed in those realms. We don't need overarching questions about what forms of intervention are acceptable, more acceptable, less acceptable. In a world where geopolitical rivalries and where contestation of values, a world of deep diversity, of accentuated pluralism, is more evident as we go forward, rethinking, well, what might be the sorts of limits to acceptable aspects of the inevitable interventions that living in a densely integrated world will give rise to. That, again, is, I think, an old-fashioned question on the agenda of the new of dealing with the global disorder that is hard not to avoid. And then fourthly and finally, I mentioned at the beginning the sort of old and the new, the global and the globalization. Well, one aspect of that, again, as I think I threw out just at the beginning, is the emergence of thinking about planetary challenges, the idea that the planetary is doing something different from just an integrated global system, an integrated global economy, even an integrated global political system. These things are complicated and difficult enough to make sense of. But what the planetary is doing is making clear that the system, the structure, the world in which we are embedded is immensely complicated. It's open, it's dynamic, it changes in non-linear ways that are extraordinarily difficult to understand. They're extraordinarily difficult to regulate, to plan for, to make sense of. And as part of that kind of thinking, there's been a move, I think, to suggest that old-fashioned debates about global order, imagining new forms of global governance, global planetary management, is entirely inappropriate for dealing with this kind of systemic complexity. This was the old world, the world of the 1970s, of scenario planning, of grand designs, of building new institutions. Instead, what we need to do is to understand more about the limits of our world, the limits of the natural world, the boundaries of the Earth system within which we live on the one hand, and to think in terms of the sorts of solutions, often bottom-up solutions, that help us deal with those problems. So the problems of order and disorder of the kind that I've been talking about in this lecture really fall away. They're both not so important and they're not so relevant. Well, just to conclude, it seems to me that that way of thinking is fundamentally misguided, because whatever sorts of solutions we think of to dealing with planetary challenges will need to be translated through the old world of interstate and interregional and intersocietal rivalry and challenge into this world of deep pluralism and diversity, the question of how burdens are going to be distributed, whose voices are going to count, through what kinds of institutions. All of those questions do remain as present today as they were before. So just to finish where I started, it is precisely in this mixture, this very complex mixture of the old and the new, that we might seek to understand what this new age of global disorder looks like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hurrell, for that very interesting talk. Before we move on to the Q&A, let me just remind everyone that the next lecture will be the 9th of July. Professor Mark Walters, the current Oliver Smithies Visiting Fellow, will be giving a talk on the laws of empire and laws of nations, reflections on the rule of law and Crown Indigenous relations in North America. And he's a professor at Queen's University in Canada. If you haven't been able to put in your question, you can do so at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the Q&A section. Please go in and ask your questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the time we have remaining. And what I'll do is I'll start in the order in which we receive them. Our first question comes from someone who's on a Fulbright scholarship researching Indian foreign policy and strategic planning. And he wants to know your reflections on the rise of the West and how middle powers reinforce or retrench regionalism as a response to great power competition. So perhaps we can get started with Nicholas's question, and then we can move on and get to as many as possible.
Great. Well, that's a crucial question, and I think it's got many dimensions to it. It's obviously very much bound up with what I hope was one of the sort of themes that came across in my lecture, which is that we have seen this longer term diffusion of power, a more strongly global system in which power has diffused both to other states, but also to societies and regions across the world. What does that then mean for how we think? So I think we can think about what that means in sort of three different ways. The first is sort of captured maybe by this idea of new non-alignment, which is a kind of refusal to commit, a desire to keep option open. After all, if one challenge to relatively weak states in the global south comes from an overpowering United States and an overpowering West, another challenge would come from an intensified or dangerously intensified confrontation between the US and China. So there are lots of reasons why keeping options open, hedging, as it's come to often be discussed, is dominant on the foreign policy agendas of many states in the global south. That's the first point. The second point is the global south as the global south, as some sort of unity, as some sort of basis for coalitional politics that might play a role. And that, again, we're seeing, there's often a kind of, either or. Well, the BRICS and the global south, either it is an absolutely unified and a great effective coalition, or it's nothing. And a lot of people, certainly in the earlier discussions about the BRICS, wanted to push back and say, oh, well, these countries really don't have that much in common. This isn't really a serious coalition that's going to play a role in world politics. I think, neither of those extremes is really right. Certainly the BRICS has come to have a much greater political reality than many expected. And certainly the idea of the global south, despite all of the things we can say about its complexity and why it doesn't really fit together or make sense, has been, I think, one of the striking features of the continuities that I've tried to stress in world politics. And then the third dimension is the one that you mentioned in your question, which is the regional one. And there, again, it's often an either-or debate. Well, yes, of course, we think we should like to see, many people would like to see, either because a way of ordering the world or because from within their own regions, effective regional institutions as a basis for, for how we think about global order. And then when we don't see very effective institutions, I say it's all a waste of time. It isn't really happening. There's not much there. Again, that either-or way of thinking about the region, I think, neglects what I stressed as the intensification of the regional and the importance of the regional in politics, even in areas where institutionalization at the regional level might not be so successful. So there would be my three ways of trying to answer the question you posed.
Thank you. The next question is what do you see as the role or the power of ideologies, which have seemed capable of persuading people to sacrifice even themselves? It says not just the political isms or even religions, but something like what Alfred Zinman referred to when writing, "So they gave their bodies to the Commonwealth," or President Biden's recent reference in Normandy to the sacrifices made on D-Day. So he asks, are you taking these movements of thought, of emotion into account?
I hope so. I hope I take them into account. One of my many criticisms of a kind of very self-described hard-nosed kind of material realist account of war and conflict is that it's never taken those sorts of questions sufficiently into account. It's all very well for, statesmen, strategists to play war games, but what actually persuades people to climb out of trenches or to risk their life can never simply be a matter of geopolitical chess. There has to be something far more powerful. Obviously, what has been most powerful in the modern period has been nationalism, but perhaps better put, the way in which nationalism, when it's been powerful, has meshed with other sets of ideological ideas. Those might be religious, they might be tied to particular sets of cultural traditions and exceptionalist accounts of where one's country fits in the global order, or put another way around, what gives power to those sorts of exceptional accounts is precisely the way it gets caught and mobilized within nationalisms. I think all ideologies, when they've been most powerful, have had to have some form of political mobilization to actually drive and embed their power. And as I say, one of the reasons for still wanting to, or still believing that we need to focus, at least in part, on the role both of existing states, but also very, very crucially of those groups that seek statehood. And again, the role of ideas of national self-determination and all of the multifarious ideas, again, secular, religious, that have gone to give meaning, power to ideas of self-determination are really crucial in doing exactly the things I think that you suggest.
Okay, thank you. And keep the questions coming. We have some really great questions. Catherine asked, do you have views or suggestions as to what kind of actors, whether formal organizations or informal groupings, are likely to have a key role in shaping future world order and should have such a key role? Such as I'm thinking of governments, not all democratic or even the democratic ones,
Yeah.
regional associations, the UN, lobbying power of corporations, etc.
Yeah. Lots of different ways of trying to capture, describe, make sense of the institutions and patterns of governance we see. One kind of important one I like quite a lot is to think of order as kind of layers. So, at the bottom, there was sort of Westphalian order of states and sovereignty and non-intervention, that kind of thing. And then you have the order embedded in the UN Charter as an attempt to sort of give greater structure, obviously on the political end, but also through all of the functional agencies, beginning on all these other areas of health and economy and so forth. And then to think of the sort of multilateral order of global governance that expanded so enormously in the 1980s, but particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, and then to see the so-called liberal order as particularly value-driven, human rights, democracy on the top of that. John Eikenberry has gone there in his writings. Joseph Weiler, a long time ago, had this idea of layers. And I think what that very usefully does is to illustrate that the forms of order happen at these different levels and that they all continue to matter. The one doesn't simply end the importance of the other. So maybe we will dramatically reduce the political salience of that overtly liberal order that lays claim to strong sets of values about human rights, democracy, and so on. But that doesn't mean necessarily that either the UN Charter Order or the dense institutional order of global governance will go away. I mean, the problems of contamination and the problems of how we keep that going, I've tried to say something about in my lecture. That order is very definitely, as I think you suggest, an order that is not just about states. It's multi-layered, it's multi-actors, many actors, it's multi-fora, global, regional. And then we can think about another way of thinking about where we might be going. One is, again, let me just throw out three. One is a continuation of that kind of pluralist order. Well, order is going to come from many different places, bottom up, in the middle, on the top. None of them are necessarily going to be more important than the other. And clearly a lot is happening when we think of what is happening and where developments in global health are happening. Networks of scientists producing vaccines and transmitting and diffusing knowledge about vaccines. All of that remains very important. I still think that the problems of relating what I call global order to global governance remain, very important for us. Even though when we think about this more kind of competitive, conflictual world of interstate relations, again, we can identify different ways in which order formation or order development might develop. One is coalitional, groups of states, groups of parts of the world developing their own views, maybe on a regional basis, but not necessarily on a regional basis. And then either, obviously, using that to manage their own affairs, but particularly if you have big blocks of states doing it, powerful regions, what they do internally will shape what happens externally. This is the way in which Europe, for all its weaknesses and problems, has sought to play a very powerful role in global governance. Think of the way in which Europe is seeking to regulate big tech. If you impose, data privacy laws inside Europe on all companies and all tech companies, then if they want to operate in that area, those norms and values have to be broadened. So different forms of coalition, but also competitive order. And again, maybe this picks up a little bit what I was saying about the Cold War. It's not always right to think of competition as antithetical to order building. Competition to come up with answers and to convince others and diffuse answers is an important part of order building and order development. So coalitional order building and competitive order building, as people like John Eikenberry have written about, are very important parts of how we think about the dynamics of order moving forward.
Thank you. Our next question from Justin has to do with the China and US relationship, and you were talking about competition. This sort of asks about cooperation and how these two countries depend on each other significantly for trade and economic growth. And the question is sort of a powerful basis for cooperation.
Yeah. I seem to be, maybe it's my sort of English or Oxford prejudices, but I think a great deal of where I seem to end up is wanting to challenge sort of either or thinking. So on US-China, we have the inevitable war with China, the John Mearsheimer type view on the one hand, and we had, now not so much, the kind of liberal entanglement, liberal socialization view on the other. If we embed and enmesh China in a modern globalized world, we will socialize China into accepting not just its interests in the status quo, but its interests in upholding the norms that we have managed to embed in that status quo. A lot of the writing in the early 2000s used that language of enmeshment and socialization. The idea again that those are the only two possibilities seems to me fundamentally mistaken. At the hard end, if you like, the geopolitical end, the idea that either we can dictate the terms of the relationship or it's pure anarchy, it's pure conflict on the other, isn't right. there's always been space, potential space, I don't say actual space, but potential space for major powers to realize that the costs of conflict are simply too big and too great, and that therefore they need to find ways of living with each other. Order is not about nice, happy coexistence where we all agree on everything. It's about finding agreements on how we disagree, even on how we conflict and how we fight each other. That's always been an important aspect. So there's space on that side for accommodation. And there is surely space, if you like, at the other end, not to say that entanglement leads to socialization and everyone joining a nice, happy, global liberal world, but that simply trying to go back to a 19th century Kissingerian world completely overlooks the extent to which the conditions of globalization, of modern globalization, and the conditions of living in a planetary system that we are all entrapped in and all condemned to face the consequences of changes from, fundamentally changes the way in which major powers, hopefully, might think about their sets of interests. After all, yes, of course, we want agreement, if you like, about the borders, agreement about the ways in which we overtly conflict. But we can all see that dealing with climate change can never just be about things we do at the border. It always has to be about how we organize our own societies, what forms of social and economic development we predict. So in some ways, I found myself in the heyday of the global liberal order being rather pessimistic, rather focusing on all the negative aspects of what global liberalism was seeking to do. Today, obviously, the dangers are enormous. And yet I think it's really important to recognize that coming both from the hard end, and maybe also thinking about some of the ways in which the changes of a globalized world might shift incentives, create some space, I think, for, if not a degree of optimism, at least the recognizing what the space for potential conversations are.
The next question by David has several upvotes, so I want to make sure that we address it. And it relates to what you were just talking about with the climate crisis. And he asks, with the apparent acceleration of the climate crisis rendering large parts of the world effectively uninhabitable, do you see the rise of nationalist politics as a preparation for raising the drawbridge? And what could work as a counterbalance to this? So the kind of collaborative acceptance of refugees and migrants post-Second World War.
Yeah, enormously difficult. I mean, I'm sitting in Berlin at the moment, and we've just seen in the European elections, not everywhere, Scandinavia was an exception, but in many major countries, we've seen the reaction against green politics and the reaction against a discussion of climate change, combined with exactly what you suggest, which is, in a sense, a putting up of the different kinds of fences and drawbridges, combined with a much more sort of nationalist approach. And of course, it's always possible to play out a view of change, which maybe on the one hand takes a kind of techno-optimist view of what sorts of ways we might have of dealing with climate change. And of course, it's precisely the more developed, powerful countries that will have more of those technological options. And it's also true that, of course, if we're talking about adaptation to what climate change is already doing, then that capacity to adapt is radically asymmetrically distributed. So you can sort of see how that argument goes, and you can certainly sort of understand the political dynamics of how it's played out, particularly in the context of an economic system and an economic scenario where insecurity and inequality and resentment against radical economic and social dislocation have all played into politics in precisely those kinds of ways. So I think understanding isn't so difficult. I still think it is pretty self-evident that the capacity even of a very rich, developed, just assuming a continuously prosperous part of the world that is only a very small part of the world, 13, 15, whatever percentage you might, depends which bits you count, can on its own survive the changes that are going to come with climate change, that you can absolutely succeed through your own technology or through putting up fences, keeping out migrants, adapting. That seems to me wholly illusory. Even if you are going through and you have an optimistic technological view about adaptation, those technologies have got to be transferred, diffused, implanted effectively in different parts of the world. That alone will demand forms of cooperation that go beyond the walls of the nation state. So I can understand exactly why and how powerful that nationalist backlash, that nationalist sense of the problems of climate change, how it emerges and how powerful it is. But the idea that it can be an answer going forward seems to me wholly illusory.
Okay, thanks. Robert has a next question. So you mentioned that part of the success of the international order was that technocratic solutions were promoted through international organizations, thus fostering cooperation around technical issues. However, one could argue that the limit of that is being reached with nations, groups, and peoples turning against these real-world consequences of those solutions, for example, within trade or migration, but also believing that the technical solutions on a number of these issues, such as climate, are inadequate. So I guess would be a comment. I don't know if you want to comment.
No, I mean, absolutely. It's a very nice expansion and gloss on it expresses much more clearly exactly, I think, where I was sort of beginning to go in that very throwaway remark I made about functionalism and neo-functionalism. I think, well, if we tell a there's a kind of naive understanding of functionalist ideas in the 20th century, somehow experts on their own are going to be able to insulate international institutions from all this nasty ideology and geopolitics. I don't think anyone really believed that. But what they did believe is that if we act as if we can separate these worlds, we know we actually can't, but if we establish institutions that seek to do that, seek to, in the context of Europe, seek to promote integration, which avoids some of the really big, political defense security issues, and that see integration as a technical. This is how we can move forward. So that pattern, I think that's the sort of best case. And as you suggest, I think that in the expansion of many ideas of global governance, the reality of technocratic functionalist solutions, after all, one aspect of global governance was precisely the idea of delegation, that you delegate powers away from direct diplomatic political involvement towards central bankers or towards committees of insurance managers, or those people who coordinate and manage capital markets, so on and so forth. This will be the way in which stable and effective global governance can work. And yet, of course, it's precisely the reaction against that, against the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the delegation, the chains of delegation getting longer, more diffuse, more open to capture by private interests, that has given rise to so much of the legitimate critique of international institutions and global governance that we've seen from both right and left. And I think it's a major problem for those liberals that want to hang on to that, is that they have to come up with better answers to those problems. The sort of answers that, as those problems sort of began to become more evident, particularly in the 2000s, 2010, was to say, well, let's have a little bit of accountability, a little bit more transparency, let a few more NGOs in, and that'll be enough. That will sort of keep the threat at bay. it won't keep the threat at bay, and that therefore it seems to me we need to rethink that relationship. All I could throw out in the lecture I gave here today was to say that one aspect of that has to be, I think, probably formal, reasonably overt discussions and agreements amongst some of the major players, sorry, excuse me, as to the scope that are given to the technocrats and to the functional specialists and to the experts. It's not something that can ever happen naturally. It has to be to say, well, in this area, for these reasons, we are prepared to do this. And a central part of our agreement is going to be because by doing it this way, it safeguards our own interests and our own power. You have two sorts of legitimacy challenges to functional specialization in institutions. One comes from those states that feel they've been disempowered, the global south in the context, say, of the WTO, but also, of course, of society that feels that sort of Davos person has taken over the running of the world, and that leads into exactly that kind of critique. There is no easy answer. I suppose my final point on this would be to say honesty about the trade-offs is the most important thing. I mean, again, it's so easy to understand why politicians don't want to be honest about the trade-offs. But unless we have honesty about the trade-offs and what is involved in dealing with these problems, we have more of this, we have less of that. That's the only way in which we can have a rational debate about how the sorts of things, the protection of national interest, the protection of national identity, security, democracy, can be dealt with in the context of deeper institutional enmeshment and tackling global governance and global challenges.
So the next question is kind of a spin-off of this. I mean, so how does the cherry picking of norms, especially by rising powers, play into this global disorder? Of course, with the caveat that it's not only rising powers that seem to be cherry picking norms, as Ukraine and Israel-Palestine responses seem to show.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And, you know, of course, I think as the question makes clear, everybody cherry picks norms. Certainly the Global South's critique of the West has been hypocrisy, selectivity, precisely cherry picking. You care about this, but you don't care about that. You know, the whataboutery type discussions about even really very crucial and powerful central norms of the international legal order to do with human rights, to do with war and peace, and so forth. And again, as I think the question made clear, that cherry picking isn't something that is only there on the part of, you know, say Europe and the United States. It's also there on the part of the Global South. Now, some of that is going to be, you know, the different kinds of cherry picking. There's a kind of, you know, I suppose there's a playing the whataboutery game. So you do this, so we do that. You know, kind of explicit responses to that kind of dynamic, which you can understand the politics of it, but is pretty destructive. There's the sort of cherry picking that goes with particular sets of interests. So I'm sort of thinking here, you know, across different parts of the Global South, the role that particular norms play in the way in which, quote unquote, the interests of the Global South are projected. So to give a concrete example, the way that South Africa, maybe for entirely obvious reasons, has made race and racial divisions, racial politics, a central part of its claims about the Middle East and about Gaza and about cases to the ICJ, in a way that other parts of the Global South have found much less central, convincing, willing to go along with. Brazil a little bit, because race and racial politics has been a part of Lula's Brazil, India much less so. So that's sort of cherry picking that reflects a kind of a differential set of interests. I suppose my point about trying to reestablish some more foundational understandings about the legal order who makes law what law is precisely to see whether we can, yes, we know about cherry picking, but can we, beyond cherry picking, actually identify some of the areas where, maybe the cherries actually sit in the same basket at least.
Okay, next question by Gerald. Can we agree to living in a pluralistic international society, abandoning thoughts of Western hegemony, without at the same time compromising the liberal values that we cherish?
Yeah. I've got a Thursday afternoon, I've got a workshop on pluralism, and I've been trying to gather my thoughts on precisely this question. I mean, I think the deep diversity, the accentuated pluralism really is, it's not just there's a heterogeneity of interests. I mean, that kind of language, of course there is, but there's something kind of deeper going on. Pluralism then, sounds like the obvious solution. Felipe Armesto says that, pluralism is perhaps the only common value that such a diverse world is able to share. But that faces, numerous counterpositions. One I've mentioned in relation to climate change, that even if you want a kind of pluralist, good fences, good neighbor type view, just coexistence, leave us alone, you can't actually have it because of the nature of many of the issues we face. A kind of return to a purely kind of closed, good neighbors, good fences world just doesn't work. But for the liberal, as you suggest, it poses particular problems because it seems to throw away, or at least to discard or to marginalize, many of the core liberal values that liberals have wanted to assert. How do you move forward? Well, I mean, I'm not pretending there are any easy answers. One, I think, is to recognize that there are different kinds of liberalism. Again, my wanting to escape from the shadow of the post-Cold War world was, I couldn't talk about it today, but I'm happy to talk about it now and in other papers, is that liberalism came to mean one thing. It came to mean liberalism as it was embodied in this particular kind of order. Whereas actually, if we think historically and across space and time, liberalism and international relations have come together in different ways. A balance of power is a central liberal idea, the idea that concentrated power is a problem domestically, internationally. Multipolarity should be the basis, could be the basis for a liberal way of thinking about global order. Sovereignty, as many people have stressed, is, it has the Hobbesian nasty side, but it also has the Lockean, necessity side. You can't have a liberal order without effective sovereignty. You can't promote liberal purposes without effective sovereign power. So lots of things of a more kind of pluralist kind can live within a different sort of liberal thinking. Certainly many of the, what I call the kind of minimalist coexistence, de-risking global politics things can certainly live within certain kinds of liberal thinking. Not surprisingly, one of the places we might want to go back to in searching for some of those ideas are precisely the mid-20th century liberals who faced the kind of catastrophes of the world in which they lived, of the first half of the 20th century and the Second World War and so on, the Judith Sklars and the Bernard Williams of this world. And what they tried to do was to find what might be the minimum conditions of a liberal order that we might identify and we might be able to hold on to. And again, I think that might that's an important part of thinking about where liberals might, what sort of order liberals might be able to envisage in which they could live together, live reasonably well, and that might also speak to the interests of other powerful players in the global system. But that still doesn't really tackle this problem about human values. Now, one way you might at least begin to open up that debate is by saying that actually pluralism isn't only about fences and telling people that they shouldn't mess around with you and they should keep out and so on. If we take a more Arendtian, Hannah Arendt view of pluralism, then we might want to ground liberal values, not in abstract notions of rights, but actually in really existing threats to pluralism. It is precisely the destruction of pluralism that constitutes the greatest sets of, or has constituted some of the greatest challenges to liberal values. Now, that still doesn't, answer all of those illiberal forces that want to keep up build their fences and keep out and say you have nothing to do with this. But it begins to open, I think, a space for a debate both about the forms of pluralism whose challenge and whose maybe destruction or threatened destruction creates a ground for a common debate. Because again, part of the critique, the pluralist critique of a overtly closed Western liberal order was it was only one part of the world that says what liberalism was. And again, a procedural part of trying to get to a different liberal order must be to open that debate to a much wider range of states and societies. So none of that, answers the problem. And I think the dilemmas of dealing with managing order, keeping global governance going, and at the same time having to respond to overt threats to some of the core values that I think almost all liberals would seek to uphold. None of those things come together easily. And again, it is precisely the trade-offs that we need to be clear and honest about in talking about that. And I think one of the dangers, as I've said, is not only have we avoided overt discussions of where global order might be going, but we've tried to evade maybe in Weberian fashion, just how difficult those trade-offs actually are.
Okay, we only have a couple more minutes, and of course, the few questions that remain. This one is a big one. Do you believe the American century has ended? How should the UK and EU approach the relationship with China if China becomes the dominant global power in the coming decades? We don't have much time to answer that one, but
okay, 2 minutes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, let me give my 2-minute answers. Well, brief answer to that. I mean, it's clearly a major question. I actually do think the American century, as I indicated at the beginning, I actually don't really believe in the American century. Not because I have anything against the United States, but I just think, a lot of, it depends on exactly what you look at. If you only look at global capitalism, the American century makes sense. If you look at cultural power and all of those things, the American century makes sense. If you think about patterns of international relations and international order, then the ideas of the American century, they either didn't ever make sense or they made sense only at particular periods of time, like the 1940s and like the post-1989 period. I've always had a rather sort of skeptical view of hegemony. Hegemony is never quite what it looks like. You can look as though you're colossally powerful, but your capacity to actually get things done is often radically limited. The United States in the post-Cold War period, or not just in the post-Cold War period, militarily absolutely unsurpassed and unrivaled. I mean, nothing comes close. Even today, nothing comes close. And yet the United States has lost every war that it's tried to fight in the post-Cold War period. So hegemony, power, American century has always been a more complex thing. And precisely for that reason, I don't actually think of replacing American hegemony with Chinese dominance. I think there's going to be much more struggle between different countries to pursue their own interests, not necessarily to seek global dominance. I'm not at all sure that China seeks global dominance. It has lots of things it wants to see, but whether that equates to global dominance is far from clear to me. And I think that then feeds back into the way we think about what Europe might do. It's very tricky because obviously Europe comes from a period of massive structural dependence on the United States for its security, combined with lots of reasons why the transatlantic alliance is important in political and value terms. But clearly, US is changing the role and the relative importance of Europe in the United States foreign policy is changing. Trump, no Trump. Europe has to think differently about its own security. Europe is no longer the primary geopolitical region in the world in a way in which it's been for arguably 200 years. That's moved to Asia. And so Europe also needs to think about what its interests and role is in a much more open world. On some of the issues, maybe it will be and continue to be very closely tied to the United States, but in others, it will be much more, I think, loosely and more open in the way it engages, including with China.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a really riveting lecture and Q&A session. And thank you to all of you who are able to join us. Just a reminder again, the 9th of July is our next online lecture with Professor Walters. Join us for that. And thank you once again for joining us for this lecture. Thank you, Professor Hurrell.
Thank you. Thank you all.